I'd like to introduce interval notation for domain and range. Domain describes the x values. Range describes the y values. We'll make a description from least to greatest. Whether we're describing x or if we're describing y, we always start at the lowest value, the least. For interval notation, anytime the endpoints are not included, the endpoints are not defined, and that may happen if you have an arrow, whether the arrow goes up or whether the arrow goes down. We will make a list from least to greatest. For interval notation, make a list. Least, comma, greatest. So since we're going to write least to greatest, if it's going down or left, we consider that to be negative infinity. And if it's going up, this one's also going left, or if it's going right, we consider that to be positive infinity. Also, if you would use a less than or a greater than, or an open circle to describe your interval, or if your graph is drawn with a dotted line, for any of these, we'll use parentheses. If the endpoints are included, so you have a solid dot or a solid curve or line. If you would use a less than or equal to, or a greater than or equal to, if you were writing an inequality, then we'll use these square brackets. Whichever one you use on the left goes with the description that is the least, and whichever symbol you use on the right goes with the description that's the greatest. The first symbol describes the lowest or the left, and then you write a comma. The second symbol describes the highest or the right, as long as it's least to greatest. Notice here in these examples that there's no x or y used. So you have to define whether you have a domain or a range. You also write domain or range next to your notation because this can look like a point. So be careful. If the symbols for the left and also for the right are parentheses, then you might mistake your interval notation for a point. But remember, when we are describing an interval, whether it's domain or range, we have the least, the smallest x, and the greatest x. It's not x, y. It's small, large x, or small, large y. This is how we would write all real numbers. If it continues negative for infinity and positive for infinity, that's all real numbers. make a note for yourself that if you have a discrete graph, which is made of dots, you can only use set notation. You can't use interval notation. The interval is describing from the lowest to the highest, the bottom to the top, the left to the right. And if nothing happens in between the points, then the only way you can accurately define the domain or the range is with set notation. However, we can use interval notation when you have a continuous graph. So if the points are connected, I will need to make note of the left side and the right side and the lowest and the highest points. From left to right, I can describe my domain as the x's from -1 to 2. So I make a list, least to greatest, and at -1, I see that I have a closed circle, so I can put a bracket there. At 2, I have an open circle, so I would use parentheses. For the range, I am describing all of the points graphed from the lowest to the highest. At the lowest, y is 0, and at the highest point, this is 2, 4, y is 4. So I write 0, 4. At 0, I have a solid curve, so I use a bracket. At 4, I have an open circle, so I use parentheses. These don't need to match each other. The left symbol goes with the left side, which is a number, and the right symbol goes with the right side. Okay? This is a function. We'll also describe this graph. My x's, since I have arrows here, I know that my x's continue to the left to infinity, to negative infinity. And my x's also continue to the right, but that is to positive infinity. So when I write my domain, I make a list, least to greatest. Negative infinity is the smallest, infinity is the largest, and infinity is always considered open, so I use parentheses for those. To describe the range, I need to look at my y's from lowest to highest. I don't have a highest place. It goes positive to infinity. I do have a lowest. My lowest y is this point, 0, -3. So from lowest to highest, I can write -3, infinity. At -3, I have a solid curve, so I use a square bracket. Infinity is always considered open, parentheses. This is a function. Last example. I'll mark this point. This point is at 1, 3, and I have an arrow. So for my domain, I'm describing all x's from negative infinity up to 1. Negative infinity, you never arrive at negative infinity, you just keep going that direction. So we write that as open. Also, at 1, I have a hole. So you can get very, very, very close to 1, but you can actually be at 1. So that's open as well. For the range, we need to describe the y's that are graphed. So here I do have a highest place. My highest y is 3, and I don't have a lowest. It goes down to negative infinity. So least to greatest, I can write negative infinity, comma 3. Infinity is open, parentheses. 3 is an open circle, parentheses. This is a function.